Hello, this is Arun Burathoki reporting for the New Brunswick Media Co-op. We are online at nbmediacoop.org. Independent Senator Kim Pate says that Canada's criminal legal system is unjust, discriminatory, and especially biased against Indigenous people and people of color. Pate has been a member of the Senate since 2016. Before that, she spent decades as an advocate for people in the prison system. She recently spoke at an event in Fredericton where the provincial government plans to build a new jail. But the senator and longtime advocate says a jail won't make the community safer. The interview was recorded on January 30th. Here's what she has to say.
I mean, part of the reason mandatory minimum penalties are problematic is we expect judges to look at all of the evidence when they're considering cases, weigh all the evidence, consider all the circumstances, both of the accused, but also victims and the overall context. And when you have a mandatory minimum penalty, the discretion essentially is taken away from the judge. The decision-making power is taken away from the judge and really put in the hands of either the police or the Crown prosecutor, because depending on what a person is charged with, that'll determine what the penalty is if they're convicted. So really it stops judges from doing the job we expect them to do, that they are appointed to do. And so that's the fundamental reason.
Mhm. Do you think Canada's legal system is biased against Indigenous women, as they make up nearly 50% of prison population?
Yeah, I think it's very clear. Oftentimes in human rights law, we talk about evidence of discrimination by adverse impact. And what that means is if you look at the end result, and if the discrimination is really clear, then it's clear there, or if the differential of representation is so clear, then it becomes obvious that we're dealing with discriminatory patterns. And so when we're talking about Indigenous women, we're talking about racialized women overall. About 10% of the federal prison population for women, where in prisons designated for women, are women of African descent. About 50% are Indigenous women, and then there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5% South Asian, other racialization. So when we see that the vast majority of those who are imprisoned are racialized, and yet they don't represent the vast majority of the population by and large. Certainly, if we focus on Indigenous women, they are 4 to 5% of the population of Canada, but 50% of the women serving 2 years or more. And in provinces like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, in the north, they are 75 to 100%, depending on the day. And when you look at just young people, so the youngest of them, so the intersections of that discrimination, then you see that they are 95 to 100%. So, that's the adverse impact. So we see, how does that happen? It could be discriminatory charging practices, discriminatory prosecution practices, judging practices, the impact of mandatory minimum penalties as well. Once they're in the system, we know that the classification scheme and the ways in which people are classified is also discriminatory. And that means if you're classified as higher security, you don't have access to programs and services, you're less likely to be released on parole or any other form of conditional release. So it has a snowball effect of compounding more and more discrimination, so that at the end you end up with Indigenous women, racialized women overall, but Indigenous women in particular, having this massive barrier to any kind of equitable access to the criminal legal system and prison system.
If building new prisons is not the solution, then how do we fix the justice system?
Well, I think it's a big part of what the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, in particular, when we're talking about women, identified, and that is that the very same issues that give rise to Indigenous women being more likely to be disappeared, murdered, homeless, are also the same issues that result in them being massively overrepresented in the prison population. So what does that mean? Well, building more jails taking more kids into care, because we know that when we look at young people, about 90% of the children of women who end up in prison end up in the care of the state, as opposed to about 10% of the children of men. Because when men are jailed, there's often a mother, a sister, an auntie, girlfriend, somebody, a grandmother left behind taking care of those children. Whereas oftentimes when the women are jailed, they're the single moms, the last ones left standing with those kids. And so, building more jails, putting more women into custody, putting more kids into care is not making us safer. In fact, what we need to be doing as Indigenous leaders all across this country and internationally have been saying is investing in community. So instead of building another jail, especially when it seems to be questionable whether in fact there is in fact overcrowding, given the way the province is counting, I think it really behooves the government to say, let's invest in communities. Let's provide better supports for young people, for children, for kids who are taken into care, in educational situations, housing, food security, all of the things that we know create more inequitable situations and put people at more risk of both being marginalized, victimized, but also criminalized and imprisoned.
Mhm. You have extensively worked on issues revolving around women in penal system. What problems have you seen, and what should be done to make it better?
Well, I think one of the challenges that I first saw that I was shocked by, quite frankly, is I had worked with young people, then with men, and then when I started focusing more exclusively on women, about it was more than 30 years ago now, I was shocked by what they got charged with, what they were convicted of, by comparison to certainly the men I had worked with, and even young people. That the number of people who were criminalized as accessories or parties to offenses in situations where they may have first been victimized and then participated, sometimes not, it's questionable to me whether it was voluntary, but at the very least had been part of working in conjunction with someone else, often trying to negotiate poverty or abuse that they were experiencing at the hands sometimes of the person they were co-accused with. And so it shocked me what women were imprisoned for, particularly when we talk about violent offenses, because obviously when we think about public safety, we're thinking we don't want people who are committing violent offenses to be putting the rest of us at risk. But when we look at the women who are in prison for violent offenses, almost all of them are reacting to violence first perpetrated against them. Not all of it self-defense, but some of it self-defense. And certainly part of the reason that we did this report, the 12 Indigenous women and the conviction review process that needs to be done, is the number of women, particularly Indigenous women and other racialized women, who end up in the system after they have fought back against the violence first perpetrated against them. But oftentimes that isn't fully explored, if at all, by the legal system. And so they're convicted of violent offenses as though they have acted in isolation, in a predatory way, against members of the public in a way that poses an ongoing risk to public safety. In fact, that's not true. And every study that has been done of women prisoners, women who are convicted, has shown that in fact very few pose a risk to public safety. And in fact, Dr. Moira Law from UNB, more than a decade ago now, 15, almost 20 years ago, was hired by the Correctional Service of Canada to propose a new way of assessing risk um, for women prisoners in particular. And she recommended something that I think was new, was unusual from a corrections perspective, but made sense with all the research that was available, not just in Canada, but internationally. And she recommended that every woman be started at minimum security, and that only if there were incidents that showed they posed a risk to public safety should their security be increased. In fact, the opposite is what happens. Because people come in with all kinds of life circumstances that put them in a deficit position in terms of opportunity, resources, power, influence, those sorts of things, they tend to be classified as higher security, even though it has nothing to do with their risk to public safety. It has everything to do with the needs they have that have not been fulfilled. And so when we're talking about prisons and the idea that we just, as a knee-jerk response, build a new prison instead of looking at, how is it that we've ended up with this incredibly skewed population? How is it that we've ended up abandoning people to the most expensive, least effective system, and that is our criminal legal system? And instead of investing in the resources, not just what we're spending now to jail women and others, but investing those resources to benefit the entire community. And I think we could go a lot further. When we talk about, I often don't like to use fiscal costs, the actual what it costs financially, but if we look at just financially even, the fact that we're jailing, especially again when it comes to women, people for, you know, not often major offenses, not often offenses that cause great public safety issues, but we're jailing them at a cost of at least $100,000, and in the federal system, up over more than $500,000 per year if they're in a higher security level. um, I just ask everybody to think about what could we be doing with those resources in the community, not just to benefit those individual women, but also the entire community, their children and others. And that's just the cost of incarceration. Then if we look at the cost of child welfare involvement as well, healthcare issues that evolve, because we know that every year spent in an institution creates additional healthcare issues and long-term consequences, particularly mental health issues. So really, we should be investing these resources in community, not in more institutions.
Uh, you had also tried to expand Bill C-5 to eliminate all mandatory minimum sentences from the criminal code. Can you tell us about this?
Sure. Well, it was a number of people. This was not an original thought by a long stretch. Irwin Cotler, who was former Minister of Justice, that when he was a member of Parliament, introduced this legislation first, and it's similar to what exists in other jurisdictions, particularly in Europe and in England and some states in Australia. And it wouldn't repeal all mandatory minimum penalties, but any that weren't repealed by Bill C-5, it would have allowed individuals or judges to not impose a mandatory minimum penalty where the judge felt it would be inappropriate. Now, that amendment was actually introduced by Senator Bernadette Clément. Initially, I had introduced it at committee. She introduced it at the Senate. It did not pass. And as well, Senator Mobina Jaffer has introduced the bill that Irwin Cotler first introduced, then I introduced, and she has also worked on for more than 20 years. And that is a similar piece of legislation to allow judges to not impose a mandatory minimum penalty where they felt it would, other sentencing principles should take priority. And it's very interesting that Justice Marion Buller, who headed up the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, has argued that in fact, for Indigenous women in particular, Section 718(2)(e), often referred to as the Gladue factors, that sentencing principle should take priority even over a mandatory minimum. And I think that's a very important point to make, and one that we may see more judges pick up. Certainly, just on Friday, the Supreme Court of Canada, I think, sent a clear message to us parliamentarians that we need to actually act to address the mandatory minimum penalties, because they took out the one that had already been repealed by Bill C-5, but have essentially sent the message that we have to act to determine which other ones need to be repealed. And I think, but sending also the clear message that judges need to not be handcuffed when they're trying to do this, and that we need to stop using our prison system as a default when we fail to shore up all of our other systems. And what I mean by that is, increasingly, it's not just Indigenous people, other racialized people, and women, but it's also poor people, it's people who have mental health and addiction issues, and prisons are not treatment centers. We know from the pandemic that we need to shore up our healthcare system overall, and in particular, we need to be looking at how do we provide those resources so that the people who have the least, the most dispossessed, aren't just sent to prison. The women who are trying to escape violence and aren't supported by the state aren't just then imprisoned when they essentially, after being deputized to protect themselves and their children, if they act to protect themselves and their children, end up facing the prison system. And that's essentially what happened to Jamie Gladue as well, although that's often not discussed because it got buried in her case. But that's a whole nother discussion.
In your view, what are the key alternatives to make Canada safer?
Well, I think we've seen if in fact jailing more people made Canada safer, then the United States, the country to the south of us, presumably should be the safest place in the world to live because they have the longest, most punitive sentences. We actually, though, jail Indigenous people at a higher rate than the United States jails those of African descent. And so when we know that, we know we have a long way to go. And when we know that the jails are full of people who are poor, racialized, increasingly those with mental health issues, often as a result of past trauma, often also people with addiction issues, that is really about them trying to negotiate poverty and trauma, then we know that we need to actually invest in community first and foremost. And so those are some of the options we should be providing, and they could be provided both as alternatives to incarceration, but also preventative measures and rehabilitative measures as well. And so it's why I think we saw following the horrific situation in Saskatchewan, the stabbings, the 12 people who died, that we didn't see Indigenous leaders coming out calling for longer, more punitive sentences. They came out saying, we need the resources so that people are feeling connected to community, they have supports, and are not feeling not in desperate situations or in situations where their mental health is deteriorating even worse and they become a risk to other people.
Mhm. Talking about TikTok, you are very active on this social media platform. Like, can you tell us what motivated you to use this social media platform and how useful it has been to educate people on law system of Canada?
Well, that's a good question. I noticed that on just because on CBC this weekend they were making fun of senators on TikTok, partially because we're old and are we really connecting with youth? The criticism that I took seriously, sorry, I should go back. I'll answer your question. So why did I go on TikTok? Because young people said, if you want to engage with young people, you need to be on the media platforms where they are, and TikTok is one of them. I said, okay, I'll do that if I can talk about substantive issues, real issues, not just, singing and dancing and nothing, although there's nothing wrong with singing and dancing. It's just that my interest was in getting across the information about what we're working on, what I think some of the issues are that are relevant for young people. And what the comedians made fun of on this past weekend was the fact that sometimes we're still talking in ways that don't connect with young people. I take that seriously. That's a valid criticism. The language that we use, the language that to even understand how bills and laws are developed can be antiquated and old. And so I'm looking forward to more suggestions from young people as to how I can do a better job in that way, because if it's not effective, then we need to improve it, obviously. But that's really the reason that I'm on TikTok, is to try and engage with young people and determine what are the issues that they either understand and want to know more about, or don't understand why we're even working on them. And I need to understand legitimate concerns they have, the concerns they have, and they are legitimate, and to actually respond to them. So that's a big part of it. It's why we also have a podcast, and every medium, people, different demographics obviously are tuned into. So we're trying to make sure that we're responsible. Part of my job as a senator is to be responsible to the public and to provide information about the work I'm doing, to be accountable. And so it's that kind of transparency and accountability that I'm hoping we achieve.
So my last question is, what's your overall view on Canada's criminal justice system? Are there any issues, and what should be done to make it better so that we can move forward?
So I refer to it as a criminal legal system because, in my humble opinion, there's not a whole lot that is just about it at this stage. As we've already discussed in terms of race, class, gender, disability. The reality is, if the odds are already stacked against you, if you end up coming to the attention of the state because you've done something wrong, and let's face it, there are very few people in this country that reach the age of majority and have not done something. So very few adults who have not, and young people who have not done something that they could have been criminalized for, but most of us aren't. There, about 10% of the Canadian population does have a record, but that is also linked to what gets monitored, by whom, and in what context. And so if we want to create a more just legal system and prison system, then we have to start with ensuring there's more equitable access to everything from clean water, housing, education, food security, healthcare, and economic security overall. And so really part of what I see my responsibility to do, particularly in the Senate, is to shore up and ensure that we have equitable social, health, and economic systems in this country so that every person has an opportunity to self-actualize and to get an education, to contribute to the community in a way that makes sense for them in accordance with their skills, interests, and abilities.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for all the work you do.
Thank you.